Good evening and welcome to this unique edition of the US Studies Online's Book Hour. We will be recording this session, so feel free to leave your cameras off or on, up to yourselves. It will be made available in YouTube on US Studies Online's page later on. This unique edition of US Studies Online's Book Hour is held in conjunction with the UCL American Research Network's 2024 conference, Nationalism Across the Americas. My name is Aya Oxman, and I'm the Book Hour host for US Studies Online. Over the next 50 minutes or so, we'll be discussing the important recent work, The New Nationalism in America and Beyond, the Deep Roots of Ethnic Nationalism in the Digital Age, published with Oxford University Press in 2022. The New Nationalism analyzes the social media campaigns of Donald Trump, Marine Le Pen, and Brexit campaigners to investigate how contemporary nationalists tap into themes of history and culture to cultivate support from white majorities. In doing so, it explained why the new nationalism has so successfully appealed to contemporary voters. I'd now like to hand over to Tom to introduce today's guests.
Thank you, Aya. I'm very grateful to be collaborating on this with you, not the least to save my voice, but also to mark this very special occasion where we're talking about a very engaging and contemporary book, which I'm looking forward to the discussion of. So, to introduce our first guest, Robert Schertzer. Robert Schertzer is an associate professor at the University of Toronto. His research examines the intersection of three areas: federalism, constitutional law, and the politics of national identity. His work has appeared in top venues, including Ethnic and Racial Studies, Publius, Nations and Nationalism, and the International Journal of Constitutional Law. His first book, The Judicial Role in a Diverse Federation, 2016, was shortlisted for the Best Book on Canadian Politics by the Canadian Political Science Association. Prior to joining the University of Toronto, he spent a decade with the Government of Canada, working on social policy, immigration policy, and intergovernmental relations. Second, Dr. Eric Taylor Woods is an associate professor in sociology at the University of Plymouth. His research examines the relationship between culture and politics, with a particular focus on nationalism. He has published in numerous academic journals, such as American Journal of Cultural Sociology, Ethnic and Racial Studies, Ethnicities and Nations, and Nationalism. His most recent book, entitled A Cultural Sociology of Anglican Mission and the Indian Residential School in Canada, The Long Road to Apology, 2016, engages with theories of cultural trauma to shed new light on Christian Indigenous relations in Canada. It's a pleasure to have you both with us here this evening, and I'd like to hand over to Aya to ask the first question.
Lovely to meet both of you. And to start things off, what is the new nationalism? Could you talk a bit about what goings on in the world inspired you to write this book?
Yeah, sure. I'll start here. Is that good? So that's a really good question, and one we actually get quite a bit, right? So the way Eric and I often talk about is when we started writing the book, we were seized with a pretty straightforward political science puzzle, right? Which I think helps us understand what the new nationalism we're talking about. And that's how did Donald Trump, this billionaire New Yorker, never really engaged with issues associated with the poor, white, rural Americans, how is he able to win? How is he able to get such widespread support in the US? And there's all similar kinds of questions happening at this time, right? We saw Marine Le Pen in France have a stunning result in the 2017 French presidential election, right? So he finished second highest votes ever for the Front National. We have Brexit happening at the exact same period of time, right? And all of this is kind of happening at a moment in 2016, 2017, where we often talk about it as populism, right? And far-right politics. We're all aware of far-right parties and populism making really steady gains, particularly in Europe for a long time, for decades, right? But something really felt different in 2016, 2017. And Eric and I had a beer. This is actually a funny story. We had a beer at a conference that said something different is happening here. We have to probably take a look at this and try to understand what's happening. And what was happening that we saw, I think is different, that was element of this new nationalist different, is there's long been these parties around in Europe and in the US, right? There's long been racist and nationalist politics in the US. Trump sounds a lot like Pat Buchanan, right? But Trump won in 2016. Le Pen is the daughter, of course, of Jean-Marie, right? The Front National in France. But again, she did much, much better in 2017 than her father. The BNP's been around for a long time in the UK making trouble. right? But in 2015, 2016, 2017, things shifted, and parties and movements that were far right or populist and nationalist were starting to win. They're starting to actually make real big, really, really serious grounds in the mainstream politics. And that's the new nationalism for us. It is this, as we could talk about a little bit more, this combination of far right politics, populist politics, nationalist politics, all being combined and actually generating significant support from large swaths of people. And our book is really about that, like the success of these kinds of ethno-nationalist parties and leaders and movements in the West, and how we're actually seeing serious gains. And for us, that's the puzzle, right? So we're seeing like anti-immigrant, anti-pluralist, anti-liberal nationalists who from 2016, 2017 really started to succeed in some of the world's like most stable, liberal, pluralistic democracies. Some people call it the global moment, right, of nationalism or global moment of populism. But for us, it's really that combination, and Eric can probably explain better than I, but this combination of these anti-migrant, far right, anti-liberal parties and leaders really gaining widespread support. And that's, you know, people took notice in 2016, 2017 of this. And we focused on 3 of them, but there are many other examples. Eric, is there anything you can add there? You can explain it better than I about what the new nationalism is and what our book was about.
No, that was great, Rob. Yeah. Thanks for starting us off.
Great first question. And Pablo, thank you for asking in the chat just what I was about to ask. So you've anticipated me very well. Yeah, it's fair to say this book could equally be titled The New Ethnic Nationalism. I think that phrase is in your subtitle. That phrase is everyone. I think you use it quite deliberately, right? You note on page 2 how a distinctively ethnic variety of nationalism has re-emerged in recent years, and later note how Trump's campaign was, quote, about more than just race. His ethnic nationalism drew upon broader ethnic conceptions of the American people. Obviously, the use of the term ethnic is rooted in a certain theoretical approach to nationalism, but on the pure, like the more basic level, why use the word ethnic? Because I think that explains and cuts to kind of the heart of this book's argument.
I could take that one, Rob, if you want. Of course, add to it as well. Well, yeah, it was quite deliberate, especially in an American context. There's a variety of new works, especially now on what's called the new Christian nationalism. There's books on white nationalism or racial nationalism. There's books on romantic nationalism. And we thought in the American context, there's a tendency, first of all, to not see ethnicity, or to see ethnicity only as something that is associated with minority groups, and rather to focus solely upon race, or most latterly, as I mentioned, Christian nationalism. But we see ethnicity, we don't see any issues with doing that, but we think by using the concept of ethnicity, it can make America more of a comparative case, because of course you have people studying forms of ethnic nationalism elsewhere, but in the American case, you see it almost as an exception, and you try to explain kind of like culturalist forms of nationalism differently. But in fact, when we combine our social media analysis with a kind of deep historical study of the historical literature on nationalism in the US, and we find it's very comparable to cases in France and the UK, where ethnicity is a kind of cultural resource that nationalists use, and to use a variety of myths and symbols that are really interrelated. And so it's hard to disaggregate white nationalism or whiteness from references to Christianity, or from references to kind of rural America vis-a-vis the city, or from references to last names, surnames, which still have some significance in the US, and so on and so forth. All of these features that are generally, in a broad rubric, are collected under the term ethnicity, which you use elsewhere, but you don't use in the American context. And we thought, if we're really going to be able to understand this new nationalism in the US and beyond, it's much better to use a concept of ethnicity rather than kind of zeroing in on race or religion or language, and in fact see this as all different dimensions of ethnic boundary making that occurs in nationalism. I don't know if you want to add to that, Rob.
Yeah. This is Eric's answered it really well, I think. I think part of so a lot of political scientists and political sociologists, they play down culture and explanations of politics, right? Particularly political scientists and studies of politics, right? And there's a lot of reasons for this, right? You play down culture because it's opaque. What is culture? It's amorphous. It's difficult to kind of like really understand and trace its causal power in our politics in history and today. And similarly, there's a movement to play down history as well, because the causal sequences of history, retrospective history, can be difficult, right, to understand for political scientists. They want clear causal mechanisms and variables in history. While there's a stream of institutionalism focused on it, others don't. There's also a tendency to play down ethnicity for very similar reasons. It's an ambiguous concept. What actually is an ethnic group? Right? And what are its parameters and what are its core tenets? And Eric and I, for each of those, we want to play up culture, history, and ethnicity, and that's part and parcel of the enterprise in the book, because we think it's these three intersecting variables and forces, right? Culture as a set of ideas and practices and rituals and beliefs that get institutionalized over time, right? Have historical influence on the path of politics, and in particular, the power of defined groups of people, leaders of ethnic groups, of prescribed, leaders of ethnic groups that conceive of themselves in a particular way. That's why we're focused in particular, I think, on ethnicity, because race is really important, as Eric said, in the US context. It is ultimately the most important boundary symbol in the United States and in the politics of the United States, but it is one among many. And in a comparable sense, it is less powerful in some contexts. In some contexts, it's very powerful, and in other contexts, it's less powerful. And it is part of this broader ethnic conception of what is an American, a true American, a real American, in scare quotes, right? But equally as powerful, or almost as powerful, as religion throughout time, and at various times is extremely powerful, right? Conceptions of the history of the United States, conceptions of the homeland, conceptions of America's place in the world. These are all powerful forces that create different myths and symbols about what America is, who is an American, who's not. And for that reason, we wanted to pull out that thread of American politics, because we see particularly a definition of who is a real and un-American, right, today playing out in our politics using some of these boundary symbols between us and them. So whenever we talk about we're doing politics, right? When we're doing nationalism in America and the UK and France, and people say well, is there any nationalism there? Because people have a concept of what nationalism is, right? And they often hear when I talk to people about the book and what we're doing, isn't that just patriotism, right? Isn't what you see in America and the UK and in France just patriotism, not nationalism? And so we have to go back and do a nationalism 101 course. And one of the first things we all learn about nationalism is there's different variants, civic and ethnic, right? And what Eric and I wanted to do is to argue in these cases that we often talk about as civic, patriotic, liberal nations, that actually there is a long-standing undercurrent of not just racial politics, but ethnic nationalism, right? A kind of broader conception that encompasses race. So that's why ethnicity, that's why we focused on it. And we think it actually has a lot to explain what's happening today and hasn't been given the attention it's probably deserved. That doesn't mean it doesn't mean there's not other forms of nationalism in these cases. That's actually a really important part, right? We often have this debate, right, with people. That means it's part of this explanation, but there's lots of forms of nationalism. Eric, I clearly cut you off.
I'm sorry we keep doubling down to this question, but to try to explain why I said we felt that it's also more comparative, and it brings America into the conversation rather than a kind of exception to the rule of nationalism around the world. If you think about the way in which whiteness is as a tendency, as a common sense shorthand in America, there's a lot more depth to whiteness than simply a kind of phenotypical kind of common sense racial concept. And you can see that when you look comparatively. Whiteness in America means to speak English with an American accent. It means to be Christian, or at least have a Christian background. It probably links you in some way to the so-called heartland. And all these a variety of issues that you can see, whiteness is clearly different than the way in which whiteness is defined in Poland or in France, and so on and so forth. And what we're talking about there, when we bring in these other indicators, whether it's Christianity, whether it's appearance, dress, religion, those are all features of ethnicity. And we really think we're hoping that this book in some way brings America into the kind of comparative conversation in that way.
Sorry, can I? This is very interesting. I mean, do you so when you make those comparisons, do you find that they tap into the same sort of feelings, sentiments, identities, if you will? All the politicians in these countries that you have looked into, you mentioned France and Poland and the United States. Is that in the same way? Are there differences, or have you found that this is a framework that works across, you know, a good generalization? You could even forecast this being emerging in another part of the world with that framework.
We hope so. Yeah. Humbly, I would submit that we hope that the kind of framework we use, I mean, we tried to, in part, the book is trying to provide a new analytical framework, a comparative framework for looking at how leaders use nationalism in their political communication. And we provide, as Rob kind of mentioned, we have a schema of 5 dimensions of ethnic nationalism, which we think can capture what's broadly similar amongst different ethnic nationalisms around the world, but it also does a good job, we think, of showing the differences. And it's really those slight differences that leaders use to kind of like tap into majority populations in their countries. So we would presume that we would see that, for example, in relation to the growth of Hindu nationalism. And so you're about to speak, Rob. I'll let you go.
Yeah, so I think that's a very good question, and I think, you know, Eric's kind of foregrounded the answer. The ways in which nationalists use ethnic or civic identity, right, I think can be systematically studied as part of the argument we're making, that they all make reference to what are the true people, right? And they all make reference to the nation's relationship or the ethnic group's relationship to religion or their homeland or their history or their place in the world. And so these kind of 5 schematic categories of identity, right, is national identity. Eric and I wanted to compare across time and across cases how these ideas and myths and symbols were used. In this cases, we compared the UK, the US, and France, right? But broadly, those categories, we you know, from a broad reading of nationalism studies, are not universal, but we think a good comparative analytical framework to understand the different way that leaders and movements would communicate about their understanding of the nation. And they often use and we saw this very clearly, and this lines up with a lot of other work, a boundary marker between us and them. So across these kind of ways about thinking about the nation, they'll talk about who is and who is not a member of the group in relation to these ideas of peoplehood and homeland and religion, right? And history and place in the world. But as Eric was saying, the content, so that you can compare there, you can kind of see how people use these conceptions, but the content, the extent of whiteness and what whiteness means, the importance of religion, in particular relationships to religion, right? Whether it's as an evangelical nation or as a secular nation, right? Or as a Catholic nation in private, but in public, la cité, and very secular in France, right? Like these kinds of ways in which the content is used shifts considerably. Right, you can see shifts across contexts in these, and over time, continuity within a case, but change across cases. And it's those things that we argue is really matters, right? That's why we think focusing on ethnicity matters rather than just this kind of broad focus on, you know, rhetoric or using ways in which people communicate or large systematic structures, because we think it's in these nuances and changes between cases of the content that actually allows certain nationalists to succeed in the marketplace, right, of politics.
So I was just thinking how as a multidisciplinary scholar who does history and other things, but also as an expat of 24 years, a lot of these conversations get very hitting home to me in many different ways. Not in the, especially because I've had this conversation about patriotism versus nationalism so many times and trying to get people to kind of accept the different terms, and so it's not just about the language you use, it's about how you present that. So it's very, very fascinating for me to listen to that. I do have another question for you here to keep things going. So populism is an inescapable term in press coverage of the new nationals, in particular in the Americas. Yet you're wary about the risk of conceptual slippage, as you say on page 10, in subsuming nationalism as a mere feature of populism. Do you think populism has a value in your analysis?
I'll go first on this because I have the biggest bug in my hat about this, right? So Eric and I are primarily scholars of nationalism, so we see things happening in the world and we hit it with our nationalism hammer, right? You know, you see something happen, you say, that's a nationalist, they're doing nationalist things, right? Or I do the same thing in my federalism work, right? I'm a federalist scholar, so oh, that's federalism. It's federalism saving us or causing us to have a problem, right? But yeah, but much more seriously, right? So there's a ton of ink, right, and airtime's been spent, as you say, on populism, right? It's the buzzword that people kind of respond to when they talk about this, right? And a focus particularly on the populist element of politics. Like people call Trump a populist, Le Pen a populist, the Brexit was a populist movement, and Erdogan, right, Modi, these are populists. Right? That's how we often talk about them rather than nationalists. And there's so much has been written on this, right? So much in the popular press and in academia. And it's all, we actually, Eric and I aren't so much arguing with this work, right? We think it's really important and actually has made really significant, the populism literature and scholarship has made really important contributions to our understanding what's happening today. And in particular, like explaining why now, like why in 2016 and 2017 and 2015 did these parties that had been around for a long time start to really make gains? They were making gains in the 90s as well, right? But they really made a lot of gains in the last 10 years. And the populism literature has been really good in explaining that, we think. In particular, drawing attention to things like economic inequality, right? So the 2008 recession, right? And rising economic inequality as a driver for support, for anti-elite support. Right, migration, sustained high levels of migration, in particular particular types of migration, the Syrian refugee crisis, and scare quotes, driving support among far-right parties in Europe. Also, backlashes to liberalization of trade policies, the rise of social media, these kind of big structural forces. The populism literature has done a good job of saying that's all kind of coalesced around a period of time, and people put different weight on them. Right, cultural backlash or economic inequality as to the drivers, but they're doing a good job of saying like, why now this is happening. But like I said, Eric and I are nationalism scholars. So populism has an issue as a concept, right? And it has particularly two issues, I think. In our work, in our book, we kind of make this case, and in our subsequent work, we made it again. Like populism is an empty concept. It is simply this idea of politics that sets a true people against a malign elite. Right? It is a thin-centered ideology. It has very little substance, right? So it is essentially the dichotomy between us, the people, and them, the elite, right? And to fill that space, you need to have deeper content, right? And this is where, Cass Mood and people are talking about the different variants. You have left-wing, right-wing populists, right? You have anti-immigrant populists, you have more authoritarian populists, where different ideas get grafted onto this simple dichotomy. For us, right, what Eric and I saw there was a tendency to downplay nationalism in that analysis, right, to just kind of talk about this as anti-immigrant, and sometimes you'd see ethno-national populists mentioned, but it's more like anti-immigrant far-right populists. That's what people were trying to explain. We wanted to look actually, well, if there is a nationalist element to this, right, if there is clearly a rhetorical element where leaders are using nationalist rhetoric, we wanted to focus on that rather than just the base dichotomy of us and them. And the second part, the really big part, which Eric will probably want to elaborate upon, is that the work on populism tends to look at exogenous factors to explain what's happening out in the world, right? So if we didn't have migration, right, then we wouldn't have Trump. If we didn't have the 2008 crisis, we wouldn't have any of these parties succeeding, right? If not for these external drivers and factors, we wouldn't be seeing the politics we're seeing today. And we disagree with that. Right. And we disagree with that because if you look back in history, if you do any history, right, then you know that these movements have a long history in their countries, right? Right-wing nationalistic movements, right, have long beguiled the politics of the West, right? They are endemic to politics. They're not like an aberration that's showed up. They're not exceptional or aberrational. They are in some cases the norm. Right? And they're suppressed and come back. And so from our perspective, looking at exogenous factors to understand the politics today doesn't help us. It just says, yeah, that's why it's coming today. It doesn't tell us about why Trump won instead of Sanders. It doesn't tell us about why right-wing politics is winning in an era of so-called a real economic inequality, but why the right wing is winning and not left-wing populism in a lot of these places, right? So there, actually, we think it's focusing on nationalism that helps us better understand this rather than using an empty term. Am I explaining that right, Eric? Because I get a bit upset about this, right? But Eric's a bit more level-headed about it.
No, I think that's good. In some way, that's our contribution to the literature on populism. I think, as Rob said, we're not saying it's wrong, but I guess we're adding content and depth to the messaging that the so-called new right populists use, and we find interpreting their messaging as nationalist messaging gives you a lot of purchase on making sense of that depth.
Great. Thank you. You mentioned social media both there, and this is a word that engages an awful lot with social media, which is an exhausting thing to engage with at the moment at the best of times. You, I think, argued quite convincingly that attributing the rise of ethnic nationalism purely to the rise of social media mistakes or ignores the role of the actual content of those messages, the things that are being communicated. To evidence this, you read through 15,000 tweets individually, which is a shocking number. Very deliberately, you kind of argue, rather than relying on machine reading or some kind of AI to read it, because you believe that having a human read through that can capture the, quote, historical, contemporary political context of those messages. Just on kind of a procedural level, and feel free to answer this more briefly or more casually. How was that process? Do you have any advice for someone looking into that kind of analysis, which is particularly key, I think, looking around our profession to ECRs entering the profession? Given the amount of huge work that involved, would you do it again?
That's a good question. I love Robert has coined this term that I think captures it well, which he calls brute force qualitative analysis, where rather than using machine learning and to look at a wide variety, a huge amount of tweets, and rather than just looking at a select number of tweets, we decide to look at all of the tweets and read them in depth and in context, which certainly is a lot of time. And certainly if you're reading it in person, involves a lot of back and forth, and I think we've had a lot of discussions about methodology and how you do, contextual analysis of Twitter from a historical and contextual perspective, and ensure that there's some way of having replicable data there. And it's not easy, and it's involved. We also had research assistants on this project, a lot of collaborative conversations at every stage of the way of where someone would read tweets and think I would code it in such a way, and then others would read the tweets again, and we'd see where coding is different or not. And it's a lot more work than simply coming up with an intercoder reliability score. We're kind of finding that if you're going to do this, you're going to have to involve in a much more conversational style about how you would code things. And I mean, it's something that Robert and I have been interested in is as machine learning develops, whether it could do it for us in the future or not. And that's something, a paper that we've been kind of playing with on whether we can test this or not. And in our future work, we're looking at nationalism and climate change. It's going to involve a more contextual study alongside a quantitative study, which will also kind of get at that. But I'll turn it over to Rob, who's kind of started off with the reading Trump's tweets. So he was in the weeds first.
Yes, so I don't recommend it because it's very painful, particularly if you're reading Trump's tweets. If you do it, I always say it's best with a coffee on an outside. That's the way to start the process when reading social media for sustained periods of time. I think Eric covered most of it there. I think a lot of the literature on social media and politics and history and sociology kind of takes one or two approaches, right? It's either very broad and high level, counting hashtags and likes, right? Counting metadata stuff, right? A more quantitative approach, or counting word frequency at very simplistic levels for huge swaths of tweets, right? Or it's very focused, you read a dozen, maybe 100 tweets maximum, but often like a dozen tweets, and you do a qualitative content analysis of those and their situation and what they're trying to invoke, right, as an instance of something. And we didn't like either of those. We could have just counted hashtags and been done with this, and the book would have been done like in 2020 or 2017 or 18, right? But instead, we wanted to actually go very deep and not just read a few, because then you have selection bias issues. You can just pick the ones that are clearly the racist tweets, right? And say, oh, there we go. What's happening? Very clear, right? Instead, we wanted to use them as a corpus in a universe. And that, as Eric said, takes a lot of time. So there were thousands of hours into this project, right? And Eric and I read everything, but we also had a team of RAs to help us, right? So and you had to take measures there then to ensure that you are hitting, while we didn't use intercode reliability, right, which is where everyone tweet codes and then you say, what is the mean, right? And how far off the mean are we? Instead, we use a discursive model. We think that was much more defensible. And the trick there is everything's transparent. So you have to make all of your coding transparent, all of your frameworks and all of your data transparent, so other people can try and also take a look at what you've done. If from an advice standpoint, that's I think the way in which you can actually follow this and go through it. The other thing is, I think for us, a big focus, more than even the empirical analysis, was the coding framework. That's what we're talking about with these kind of 5 reference of identity. So spending a ton of time for us on like what we mean by these categories, that we spend a lot of time at the outset in thinking through that and trying to figure out how to actually trace what is ethnic nationalism compared to other forms of politics, right? And that often, like from an advice standpoint, is where you should spend a lot of your time. Not just on the empirical analysis, but in thinking through the theoretical framework. And Eric and I, that's something that we really, I think most of our time was spent on that, and then a few months or years reading tweets, right? But the actual intellectual effort is at the outset as well.
Sorry. Go ahead. Sorry.
Continue, Bill.
Oh, just to say, there's something that I just can't get my head around. If there's an advantage to looking at millions of tweets, for example, but social media occurs as a conversation, and you can't look at it in isolation. And we couldn't, when we were thinking, should we just scrape all of the data, or should we look at this qualitatively? Sometimes you'll have 5 tweets in succession that are all part of one story. And sometimes those tweets will also be links to other tweets or other video content or images. And it could be responses, it could be hooked into hashtag. And if you just get a frequency of words, you're kind of missing the way that occurred. And it's also happening in time. And so tweets will respond to events across time. And we were looking at political campaigns, which are in a kind of time bounded space. And, we found that political leaders doubled down onto certain types of content at certain periods in the campaign. And you would also miss that kind of process, the processual dimension.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can't atomize a tweet, right? And this is the problem with a lot of the quantitative work. Even the qualitative work, it atomizes it and takes it without its a sequential context, and codes and dog whistles and concepts and hashtags do this to agree, but it's not. It's usually something else. It's said in the tweet, which references something said 8 months ago, right? But the person has tweeted it 8 months ago, talked about it out on the campaign trail, come back and retweeted it. And even a really serious large language model right now can't follow that contextual thread, right? And it's not, as Eric said, it's not where I have a whole other project where I'm doing large language models to explore Supreme Court decisions, right? Because they're more structured and you can actually do it quite well, and you can teach the machine to actually learn and code and find ideas. In social media, it's a little bit more difficult. I'm sure it will get there. But as Eric said, we also are exploring the extent to which it gets as good as a human coder, and you actually can find the historical context. The gains are very serious, very fast. But I still think I think I will probably always stand up and say there's always going to be a room for really in-depth human coding. And to do it at scale means you're not just picking winners and losers, right? If you do it at scale and you dedicate the time and effort, then you can find these patterns rather than just reading individual.
Well, so that's great to ask what I was going to ask, which is, so presumably the campaigning and the messaging, let's say, goes towards the ethnic characteristics, the ethnic groups you're talking about. So in that case, white and religious and Christian and so on. My question is how, because on the other hand, they also have to be elected, although Trump didn't count on a lot of black votes in the last election, but for example, this time there seems to be a little bit more focus. In fact, there's some AI. I was just reading this afternoon about some AI generated pictures of Trump with black voters and so on. And I was just trying to, my question is, how does the group that doesn't belong to the ethnic targets that they want to target, how do they come into this? How do they message these people? Because on the one hand, they want to reinforce the ethnic majority, but then they have to count on some minority.
So are you talking about targeting of audiences through social media, like specifically versus and how that message would deviate from other messages in the broader campaign, or are you talking more about like how Trump actually talks about both the in-group and the out-group?
Well, both actually. The question wasn't about social media necessarily, but you do have that great databases. So either way, I think it's important to know how do they address these people if their discourse is all to the majority.
Do you want to go for it?
It's a great question, and I mean both Biden and Trump were not wholesale, civic nationalists or ethnic nationalists, and certainly not Trump, and certainly not Marine Le Pen. The messaging does shift according to audience, and Trump's campaign peppers it all kinds of ways in order to target non-white audiences. But interestingly, something that came out of, it wasn't really, what we were trying to achieve with the book, but there's a kind of interesting there's a shift in Trump's messaging between 2016, 2020, and now 2024. And and there's also differences in the way that he refers to different groups, from which you can kind of see the proximity to how close someone is a kind of real American, which I found this kind of like really interesting data where it's Robert who first found it. So if he's referring to Islam, which he did a lot in 2016, he almost never did in 2020, strangely, 100% negative tweets every time. It's a clear outgroup from a kind of Trump campaign perspective. There's no possibility of being a real American if you are Muslim. In his campaigning. If you're Hispanic American, it's more mixed. You can kind of be American in some contexts, but certainly not if you're an immigrant, a first-generation immigrant, and certainly not if you speak Spanish as a first language. With Black Americans, similarly, it's very mixed. Black Americans are more referred to as Americans in the context of Trump's tweets, like they're closer to the in-group, but it's also a huge number of his tweets are couching it in a negative context of like broken cities, crime-ridden cities, so on and so forth. So you can kind of see, despite that he's targeting different audiences, different times, when you look at his tweets as a whole, you can kind of see this really interesting like portrait of from his perspective, and I would argue from the perspective of a lot of white Americans, this kind of like spectrum, or maybe not a spectrum, but a kind of circle of getting closer and closer to the core of who is a real American. And when you're talking about Black Americans are very close in many ways to being a real American, but because they can't transcend the racial boundary, they're always on the outside as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of that is, as we talked about in the book, is and a little bit in some of our subsequent work, Trump doesn't really talk about the in-group directly, about who is a real American. He likes to define it by who it's not, right? This is a big part of his rhetoric. So he often speaks about the other, about the dangerous, illegal migrant, right? Who's coming to kill beautiful women in the suburbs, like in his actual quotes, right? And he's talking about who the in-group is under threat here, right? Through omission, right? And he talks about his silent majority, but he doesn't until 2022, he never tweeted or spoke the word white. He never talked about white people. It was until 2022 was his first time he really actually started to talk about white people being discriminated against in America. So he waited until that whole time span, right, until he actually started to invoke very, very clear about who his in-group is. At the same time, there's no question about who his dog whistles are and who he's actually talking about, right? But in his targeting of the outgroups, as Eric said, there is this kind of gradients between how serious his target is and how much he balances it, because he did do this. It was almost, this is where the sequential matters. He would tweet something horrendous about Black people in the United States and then tweet, but I have lots of Black friends. Like the next tweet, immediately proximate to it, right? And so there was a balancing happening in how he was communicating, which is abhorrent. But that was a part of the ways in which he actually would try and go about and talk and try and target groups and bring them within distance to the in-group.
Absolutely. And that does lead towards our next question as well, talking about the different forms of politics as well as different nationalist modes and so on, as you were just saying. But as we mentioned earlier, this book mainly focuses on France, the US, and the UK. But seeing as we have about 10 minutes left and we're here today at a conference called Nationalism Across the Americas, do you think your conclusions apply to the rest of Americas? For example, Jair Bolsonaro's Brazil or Javier Milei's Argentina?
Oh, we hope so. we as our humble submission, and would love to think comparatively across the Americas as well, because of course America is often, the United States is often compared with European countries and less so, but of course it's also a settler colony. And I often think in comparative context with Mexico, and I think there's going to be a great study there at some point where you also have a kind of core vision of real Mexicans, which is somewhat different with the kind of myth of mestizo, but also these boundaries with indigenous communities as well. And I think there's a lot of comparative purchase and a lot that we could learn by looking at the Americas as well.
Yeah, and I'll just I think the argument travels that it's deep-seated ethnic conceptions of identity that are institutionalized over time shape politics, that today's nationalism is not new. It's rather a reinstigation of existing myths and symbols and ideas, right? Whether those are ethnic or civic. In some of our later work, we also talk about the power of the civic myths over time, right, in our more recent work. And I think that idea travels. And I think our framework to explore how those identities are manifesting themselves travels. Like that was specifically designed that way. And I think the argument that it's the content that matters also travels, right? So it's the idea that it's the particulars, not just this diametric between us and them, right? That just the adoption. Because the argument today is, oh, Trump did it, I'm going to do it, right? Or look at the Brexit worked, I'm going to try this. Or look at Erdogan, or look at Putin being strongman, I'm going to take that, and I'm going to employ that, right? And this whole concept of Bolsonaro being Trump in Brazil, the Bolsonaro is not adopting the same rhetoric Trump is. He's adopting some of the style elements, and there's a lot to style and performative politics, but our argument is the content that matters. So without doing, that's the argument, as Eric says, optimistically, I hope so. But I think there's a case to do that work, is what I would say, right? To actually say, okay, we know a lot about what Trump gets a lot of attention in America. So we have quite a bit of data there to look at, not just from our work, but from others. And a comparative analysis of what he's saying, not just how he's saying it, will help us see what is it that's reverberating in the US versus what is reverberating in other contexts.
I mean, I just want to say, I think this conference is just incredibly important, because I think the kind of mythology around America that it's, or I mean US America, that it's somehow an exception to the rule of nationalism in the old world. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to kind of contest that. And a lot of it is built on a kind of mythology, really, rather than sustained analysis. And, I was emailing with Tom earlier. There's only been 2 major edited volumes kind of looking at nationalism in the Americas. I know the major nationalism journals rarely receive submissions from the Americas. And I think there's a lot of work to be done there to understand how nationalism works. And in part, you need to do some myth busting around, is mestizo a reality, or is that just a myth? Is the myth of we're a multiracial society in Brazil a reality, or is it a myth? I would suggest it's a myth that Bolsonaro is doing so well politically. And you can see that right across the Americas. And I think there's ethno-nationalists can gain a lot of purchase there because you do have similar structures in the Americas as elsewhere. And we're not as kind of mixed and pluralistic as we think we are.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Maybe just a more fun question to end on. Well, maybe fun. We'll see what your answer is. With the few minutes we have remaining, we can have two political experts without asking for some predictions. You conclude on page 192 of this book that, quote, "The new nationalism is not new. It is not going away. This is not the end." Optimistic reading for a Friday evening. Ahead of this year's US presidential election, ahead of a British election next week, which has been increasingly characterized by quite outrageous rhetoric, let's say, with the far right winning 1/3 of votes in France and 1/4 of votes in Italy, with me being here in Munich, where, again, this kind of politics is really growing in Germany. What is next of this new nationalism? What can we expect over the year ahead?
I don't know if anyone watched the debate last night, the US presidential debate last night. It was difficult to watch. I think Eric and I are probably, I'll speak for myself, that I don't think that we're in a moment where this is going to end, right? The results of the European election are telling, right? And the thing about historical moments is we always teach and research and talk about them as, the French Revolution happened, put a flag point in, and then, and that's when things changed, right? The American Revolution happened, and then put a flag point in. But moments take time, right? And we are in certainly a nationalist resurgent moment, and moments can last a very long time while you're in them, right? Historically, they might appear brief, but they can take a long time. I don't think we're anywhere near the end of this, right? 74 million people voted for Trump in 2020, knowing everything you could possibly know about him. Marine Le Pen's numbers went up in 2022, and she's currently beating Macron in the polls, right? So the idea that just because Macron wins or Biden won, right, or Biden may win again, or someone else may be Trump, right? The idea that the politics and the political programs and the ideas that they've raised into our politics is just going to go away and is defeated, that's a fallacy, right? It restructures politics and it opens up new avenues. And for those of us who think that this is a malign force, that's a very bad thing, right? It's a very bad thing. But it also means that we have to take it very seriously. And this is something that Eric and I often do talk about. We can't simply ignore it, right? It has to be taken seriously as part of our politics today. And covering your eyes or simply saying that you shouldn't be a nationalist isn't going to work. That's not where we're at in our politics today. And it's a very serious force. I'm very scared about what's going to happen from the 2024 election. And Eric and I have done a paper on it. And Eric could talk about that, because we literally wrote a paper on this, on Biden 2020 and what's going to happen, and what we see from this. So maybe Eric, if you can talk about that a little bit.
I'm completely agree with you, Rob, that we're still in the moment. I mean, even if in the UK context, as it looks like, if Labour wins in a landslide, you've got really interesting developments on the right with the kind of ongoing collapse of the Conservative Party and a kind of takeover from the right, and then going further right towards the Reform Party, and an increasingly willingness to speak about us rather than just speaking about us in code. You can see that kind of emerging more and more through the rhetoric of Reform Party. So I think we're going to see that emerge even more going forward.
Thank you. That is a great way to end what has surely been a great UCL America's Research Network's 2024 conference. And from my side with the US Studies Online, I just want to thank you all for having this unique collaboration event today for our special book hour. Thank you, Robert, and thank you, Eric, very, very much. And thank you, Tom, for organizing.
Yeah,
thanks very much. Thanks for having us. Yeah, thanks for having us.